Hello guys, Bogdan Bratis from SaaSpot here. Today we're gonna talk about podcast SEO, and you may be wondering, what is podcast SEO? You may have heard this term before. You probably heard SEO for sure, but you never heard of maybe podcast SEO, and that if that's even a thing, because here's the catch, guys. Podcast SEO as a discipline is not very recognized in the SEO industry. It doesn't really have rules around it. There's not a lot of people practicing it. I've seen a few guys talking about podcast SEO on YouTube, but not a lot of people actually teaching how this can be done and what actual steps you can take to make this happen. And today I'm going to show you what you need to do to grow your podcast and to ensure that it's discoverable on platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and so on. Now, to understand what podcast SEO is, we need to understand first what SEO is in general. SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. Traditionally, you would create content or a web page and you would try to rank it on the first page of Google. That's usually what SEO is. And in order to do that, there's a lot of techniques you can use to make that happen. And you want to make sure that it's on the first page, probably on the first result, second result, third result, whatever. And the higher you are in the search results, the more traffic you get to your website, the more leads you start to convert, and obviously the more money you make. And that's kind of like what SEO is at the end of the day. Now, with podcast SEO, that really doesn't apply. And that's because we are talking about in-platform SEO. So in Apple Podcasts, which has totally different rules, if any, if that makes sense. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Also, SEO has different disciplines as well. So when we talk about SEO, we usually say on-site SEO, which deals with how the content of a website is written and formatted, and exactly what meta titles, meta descriptions we add in there, and so on. So that's on-site SEO. Off-site SEO relates to what you do outside the website in order to affect the ranking of your content on the website. So for example, you could get backlinks from a very authoritative website and link that to your website. Right? So I'm saying website a lot because for the lack of a better word, but the idea is that you send a link from one website to your own website, and that would indicate Google that your website is actually relevant for a certain keyword, and it will push it up in ranking. So that's kind of like what off-site SEO is. And it also has to do with building authority around your brand as well. And then we've got technical SEO. And this deals with everything that is related to the technicalities around your website. So, for example, how is your website coded? Do you have too much code on this page, which makes the page heavy to load, and that as a result makes it very slow, and Google doesn't like that and penalizes your rankings? Other things such as imagery. Is the image too big? Do we need to shrink down the image so obviously there's less information, better speeds of your website, mobile friendliness, things like that? How many files does this page actually pulls down in order to serve the content to you? The more files a page needs to crawl to serve to you, the harder the page will load, and obviously Google doesn't like that. In podcasting SEO, we usually don't need to worry about that. There is one thing that we may need to worry about is when we repurpose content from the podcast on traditional SEO, and we're going to touch on that in a second. Now, let's talk about podcast SEO. But before that, my mouth went dry and I need to get some tea. I usually have coffee, but I had 3 coffees today, or I believe 4. So that's too much coffee for today. So probably that's why I talk so much as well. So let's go forward. Before I move forward, I want to give a shout out to my company, SaaSpot. If you want to start a podcast, you might want to consider SaaSpot for your show. We've got a podcast hosting platform you can use, which is really, really cool. It's really affordable, and you can post your podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, you name it. And then you can also use our podcast production services. We've got podcast consultations, podcast post-production services, pre-production services, press releases, you name it. We've got everything, and we can make your podcast a success. So if you're interested to work with me and my team, go to saspa.com, and you're going to find a form somewhere there or a tidy call calendar, and you can book a call with me and make your podcast work. So thank you so much, and now let's go back to the video. So what is podcast SEO? Podcast SEO is the process of increasing visibility of a podcast on a podcast directory, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, you name it. Now, it's also mentioned a lot when building backlinks and press mentions. And the reason why that happens is because podcasting can be a very good PR vehicle for your brand. So when you create a podcast, you will get press mentions if the podcast is visible and it gets viral. So for example, if you said something in your podcast, or your guest said something in your podcast and it's picked by press, or you pitched it to press or on a certain magazine, you will be able to build authority, and you'll be able to build backlinks to your podcast and to your website, not just your podcast, but also your brand as well that powers that podcast, for example. And that's very, very powerful. And there are a few ways you can do that. First, like I said, you can get mentioned into some sort of publication. That could be magazines, press, blogs, listicles, you name it. It's also discussed when we talk about podcast directories. So for example, if I distribute my podcast on 20 different podcast players, if I put my website into the show notes, all those players will return back a backlink. Now, those backlinks may be do follow or non-follow. Most will be no follow, but the ones that will be do follow will actually affect your rankings. And even the no follow ones will help you with the authority of your brand, because that's still a brand mention. And if you get mentioned into a good podcast player, that's still going to count in the eyes of Google. Also, podcast SEO can also be applied when we talk about getting guests mentioning your podcast on their websites. So for example, they could do that as featured on the pod files, for example, and they would send a link back to your website. So we could talk about that as well. And also, when you go and guest on a podcast, you go to be featured on a podcast yourself, and you tell those people that are producing the podcast, look, I want you to include the link to my website in the show notes. And obviously that will be distributed on all the different platforms, plus on their own website, which will give you another backlink. So a lot of people talk about podcast SEO in all these contexts, not just discoverability on Apple Podcasts or another podcast player, but also techniques on how to do traditional SEO with podcasting, which is quite interesting. And we're going to talk about both of them today. And we're going to touch on discoverability in Apple Podcasts first, because I think that's the most important topic for today, and I think you're going to enjoy the most. So let's go. Specifically, we're going to talk about Apple, because if you manage to rank on Apple, you're pretty much going to rank on most of them. It's not easy to make everyone happy. So you won't be able to rank, on the first page on Apple and Spotify at the same time. It doesn't really matter as long as you kind of like take one of the platforms as a main platform and you try to optimize for that, and you know that your audience is listening to your podcast there. That's all that matters. Now, before you go and implement those strategies, you need to think about the keywords that you are going to optimize for. And I would try to optimize for one keyword at the start. And for example, in my case, for my own podcast is content marketing. At the beginning, I didn't optimize it, and my podcast didn't show up for content marketing. And that's because if there was no mention of content marketing in the title of the podcast, the author tag of the podcast, none of the titles actually mentioned content marketing. Even though I talked about content marketing, there were no mentions. So you want to make sure that you find the right keyword first. And in order to find the right keyword, you'll need to think a little bit, to have a little bit of common sense. Like, think about what people are searching for, right? So content marketing could be a keyword that people would search in Apple Podcasts to find podcasts that talk about that, or could be SEO. So, or for example, financial planning, or how to make money. I don't know, stuff like that. I think this is something that you need to think about a little bit, because if you optimize for the wrong keyword, you will rank for it, but is that useful to you, right? You could also use traditional methods, such as go and Google something and see how many mentions of that keyword there are. Like, do people write about this topic? You could use tools such as Ahrefs or SEMrush, or you name it, and see what keywords rank on Google, and kind of like take a guess if that particular keyword has search volume. I also found a website, I never tried it. I think it's podseo.com, and that one is more like Ahrefs for podcasting only, which is quite interesting, and I'm gonna make a review of it at some point in the future. We found our keyword. What we want to make sure is that our podcast is in the right category. So if you are into content marketing, as I am, you need to choose the category as marketing within business. So Apple Podcasts has a list of categories they accept. You want to follow that, and most podcast hosting platforms, they have all these categories based on what Apple recommends. So want to make sure that if you're a financial planner, you have the tag, for example, in finance or something like that. Then we need to make sure that the technical part is optimized. So, for example, the artwork corresponds to Apple's specifications. You need to ensure that it's 3000 by 3000. It doesn't have logos and things like that on it. It's clean and it looks professional, things like that. You'll want to make sure that you have that keyword in the title in some way. You may have your podcast, the name of your podcast, but you also can have an extension of the name. So you could have, for example, the pod files, content marketing in creator economy world, something like that. And then obviously I optimize for content marketing and creator economy at the same time, which is really, really good. After that, what you want to do is you want to add your keywords into the description of the episodes. Now, a lot of people say that keywords in the description of the episodes, they don't count for rankability on Apple Podcasts. There's no data to back that up, to be honest. A lot of people assume that's the case. I would place my keywords into the description. It probably would help to rank higher in Apple Podcasts, and not just Apple Podcasts, but other players may use the description of a podcast, for ranking purposes. So it's good to have it there as well. You might want to have it in the first 400 characters inside your podcast show notes. The next part where you want to have your keywords placed, and we want to avoid keyword stuffing, so you need to be strategic about it, and you want to make sure that the podcast looks good and it's not stuffed with keywords. You don't want to do that. In the author tag, you could place this keyword in a very subtle way. Don't place, I've seen people putting like 6, 7, 8, 9 keywords in there. Don't do that. Just put one keyword. So for example, in my case, I said Bogdan Bratis is the author, content marketing expert, right? You could do the same for your business, financial expert or anything like that, right? You also want to get reviews on Apple Podcasts because those reviews, they create authority and it's a good indication that your podcast is listened to. Also, if you could have your listeners actually mention the keywords in the reviews, that would also help as well. It is important that people listen to your show. Otherwise, everything that I mentioned is not going to take effect. So you want to make sure that you get downloads on Apple Podcasts and people actually go through the content a little bit. And you can send traffic to your episodes. You could do that through paid ads, off the platform because you cannot run ads on Apple Podcasts, but you can run ads on Facebook, for example, and send people to Apple Podcasts. And if they actually click and start listening, that's a good indication that your podcast actually has value, and Apple will start pushing it up. Also, temporarily, you may want to target a slightly easier keyword to rank for, because you may rank for a certain keyword, but if you don't rank in the top result, it's not useful. You might want to rank for one keyword at the start and then slightly change later on once you get an audience that listens to your podcast recurrently. And finally, consistency. Consistency is key. If you post a podcast, if you create a podcast, you need to make sure that you are out there every single time. If that is a weekly podcast, bi-weekly, monthly podcast, it doesn't matter as long as it's consistent and it's fresh. Apple Podcasts loves fresh content, so you want to give it that, right? So this is what you need to do to ensure that your podcast ranks on podcast directories. Now, podcast SEO, it's also when we repurpose podcast content in traditional SEO. So, for example, we would get a certain episode and we turn that into an actual article. So what you don't want to do is create content based on the episode and basically describe what happened in the podcast. When you do that, the content on Google may not rank, and that's a problem. What you want to do is create standalone content related to your podcast. So for example, let's say you had an episode about how to make money in your 30s, and you talked with your guest about that topic. What you want to do is create an article on the same topic, give loads of tips in there, make sure that it's as optimized as possible, and obviously reference your podcast in the article as much as possible. And Google loves this kind of content because it really attacks the EEAT, which we discussed in a previous video, a link right here on the top of the video. Now, what do you need to do to make that article actually rank on Google? Now, I would say that this is a topic for another video, but in general, what you want to do is ensure that the article is optimized from an SEO perspective, so on-site SEO. So you add the right meta title, the right meta description, you ensure that you have the keywords in the headings, spread across the article, and so on. There's many techniques you can use here to make that happen. Generally, you want to make sure that you use SEO best practices for that to happen. One technique that I would definitely use is, once I created the article, I would put the article in the show notes. Now, when that episode is distributed to all the different platforms, each platform will send a backlink to the article, which will help the actual article rank in Google, which will send you traffic to your website. And on the web page, you want to make sure that you have the YouTube embed code placed in there. So there's a YouTube player and also your Apple podcast player, so people can actually listen to your podcast from your webpage, which is quite neat and convenient for people. So they would press play and they will discover your actual podcast, which is really useful. So if you like this content, make sure that you let me know down in the comments you like the content or you didn't like it, or if you have any questions about specific techniques, I'm happy to answer them in the comments. Also, subscribe to the channel, give a like to this video because it's going to help the algorithm discover our videos, which is very important. And also, if you listen to my podcast, follow my podcast on Apple and all the different channels out there, and make sure that you stay up to date with everything I do. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.